Welcome. I had you read this Oxford very short introduction to medical ethics, and I think it's an interesting book because it tries to introduce stuff, but in a lot of ways, it has an impossible task. I mean, medical ethics is incredibly diverse. It ranges from really small empirical issues in medicine and how they deal with the ethical implications of that. It deals with really large scale stuff on public health and how we maximize health benefits for all of society, to future problems with technologies, to the history of medicine and why it might be problematic and how we can correct certain things. There's so many issues in medical ethics, and I think you see that in the examples that the authors choose in this particular book. But what I want to do with this lecture is I want to sort of go over the core ideas in medical ethics and the core sets of values that are going to help us to render judgments as the semester goes on. Okay, so that's what I want to come out of this. This book, I mean, it uses a lot of this information, and sometimes it talks about this in a little bit of detail. But I want to make all of these frames explicit, and I, in specific, want to talk about the four principles of biomedical ethics, and then three big normative theories. As in, if you read more literature on medical ethics, or if you talk with other medical ethicists, if you understand the four principles and you understand the big three of normative ethics, you're probably going to be in a really good shape whenever you understand stuff. But, I don't want to waste your time. Okay, I need to prove to you why it's important to study ethics or to study the ways in which we think. And what I want to do that is to spend a little bit of time talking about the Wasson selection task. Okay, so this is a simple psychological task. Hopefully you haven't heard of it just for the sake of this demonstration. But basically, in front of you, they put four cards. Okay, and because the experimenter tells you that on these four cards, if there's a number on one side, there's a color on the other, okay? So I set out these four cards in front of you, right? 3, 8, a red card, and a brown card. You know if there's a number on one side, there's a color on the other. And then I tell you this. I tell you, if a card has an even number on one side, then it must be red on the opposite side. And I'll repeat that, okay? If a card has an even number on one side, then it must be red on the opposite side. So my question to you is, which cards do you have to flip over to know whether that rule holds true? So again, the rule. If the card has an even number on one side, then it must be red on the opposite side. Feel free to pause the video while you think about this, right? Because I'm just going to go straight into the solution. Here's the solution, okay? So if you are trying to prove the rule right, or see whether it's right, that if there's an even number on one side, then it has to be red on the other. A lot of us realize that what we have to do is we have to turn over 8, right? Because it's an even number. And if we turn it over and it's red, then we know that the rule is followed. But if it's any other color, we know that the rule is broken. We know that we don't have to turn over 3, right? Because it's not an even number. So our rule just simply isn't about it, all right? We also know that we don't have to turn over red. Why is that the case? Well, it's because if it doesn't matter what's on the opposite side of the red card. If it's an even card, then it follows the rule. But if it's an odd number, then our rule just doesn't talk about it. So no matter what is on the opposite side of the red card, it just doesn't really matter, right? And while most of us get that we have to turn over 8, almost all of us forget that we also have to turn over brown. Why is that the case? Well, you have to understand that whenever you're trying to prove a rule, if there's an even number on one side, then it has to be red on the other. You have to try to disprove yourself, okay? So if we turn over the brown and we find an odd number, okay, great. Our rule is still in play. But if we turn over the brown and we find an even number, then we find at least one instance where the rule isn't followed. Okay? One of the things that this relates to is what they sometimes call confirmation bias. Okay? Basically, your brain is this really fantastic organ. It, is small. Put your two fists together, and that's roughly the size of your brain. It doesn't weigh that much relative to your body mass, yet it consumes a ton of your energy. Okay? It takes a ton of effort to slow down and think clearly about things, especially when they're abstract problems or problems that are unfamiliar for us. So one of the ways that we try to speed up thinking is with what are called heuristics, mental shortcuts, or biases, ways in which our brain just falls into certain patterns. Now, these can be bad, right? And that's why I'm talking about this. One of the worst ones that we're going to have to deal with this in this class, I mean, in addition to a bunch of other things, especially considering, gender, race, socioeconomic class, all that kind of stuff, is confirmation bias. Because what confirmation bias is that whenever we're looking to criticize our own ideas, very rarely do we look for countervailing information. Almost always, we look for information that would prove us right. We don't look for information that would prove us wrong, okay? That's a really, really bad habit to be in, especially in philosophy, okay? Especially in philosophy. What we want to do in philosophy is we want to do a few things specifically, okay? And I want you to be aware of these three things anytime we're reading a medical ethics article, all right? One thing that we want to be very, very cognizant of is trying to define our terms, okay? If there's a term that the philosopher is using, you have to be very, very careful that they actually have it defined well. Now, sometimes you only need a working definition because the term isn't doing too much work for your particular argument. But there are a lot of times where if you press on what exactly a term means, that you can start to see whether the argument will work one way or the other. Okay? Now, one of the classical distinctions that we're going to have to make here, and you absolutely need to keep this straight, is the difference between normative and descriptive. All right? So I'm going to put descriptive and normative. Sometimes people will try to call these facts versus values. All right? In medicine, especially, this is really, really tough to tease apart, okay? But let me define what these terms mean. A descriptive term or a descriptive claim is about facts. It's about the way the world is. Okay? Whereas normative claims, as in norm or normal, they're about values. They're about the way the world should be. Sorry about that. The reason why this matters is because you kind of investigate them in different ways, all right? In medicine and medical ethics, descriptive claims you can kind of approach scientifically. You can read more literature to kind of figure out, you can take measurements, etc. What is someone's blood pressure? That's an example of a descriptive claim. Blood pressure, right? What is someone's blood pressure? So 120/80, right? That is a claim about the way the world is. How would you measure that? Well, you use a blood pressure cuff, right? Or you use any sort of method. Or if you think that it's wrong, maybe you have someone else do it or use a different cuff, right? That's what you have to deal with. But sometimes we get into more slippery conversations, and I want to just target a word that is kind of gray, and that is health. Or what does it mean to be healthy? Okay? Now, if the patient asks, what is a healthy blood pressure? Okay? You've sort of shifted from the descriptive to the normative. Because what the normative is doing is it's basically sorting good from bad, right? It's sorting right from wrong. It's sorting just from unjust. And it's sorting beautiful from ugly. All right? These are values. These are things that are much harder to measure. And these are things that are putting things into piles where you're saying that pile is better than the other pile, right? So with health, 120/80, we know that that's sort of the normal range for something like the blood pressure, right? If it deviates a little bit from that, no big deal. But now whenever you start to talk about hypertension, what if there's someone who has, a running blood pressure of like 130/90? What do we do with that? Okay. Whenever you're having that conversation about whether that's healthy or not, you're typically relying on a bunch of stuff that's trying to help you to decide whether it fits this particular value, right? And especially with something like blood pressure, it's really just the long-term effects. Maybe it affects your kidneys. Maybe it affects, risk for cardiovascular disease or stroke or something like that. You have a little bit looser of a method of defining what's going on with health as opposed to what the actual measurement is, right? Okay, so a descriptive claim, just to reiterate, is about the way the world is. It's something like, what is the mass of that particular object, right? What is the temperature of the tea that I'm drinking? Whereas the normative claims, they're values, okay? And these are going to be especially important for our class. And the values, right, are talking about the way the world should be, okay? Now, typically, most philosophers are going to acknowledge that there's a gap between the descriptive and the normative, meaning you can't get to one from the other. You have to sort of investigate them carefully and individually. All right? I think that's mostly, it's good advice to try to get all of the facts straight and to try to get the value straight, okay? And so that's going to be our approach. That's going to be our approach for this particular class. And that's why, for example, I've assigned the books that I've assigned, right? We have a lot of different books. The next book that we're going to read, right, is White Coat, Black Hat. This is going to be about the pharmaceutical industry and lots of medical ethics problems. The one after that, Dying of Whiteness, right? This is about public health crises and poverty and the effect that it has on health. We're going to read a book on race and the history of racism within gynecology and the medical sciences. And then we're going to read a book on death, right? To try to understand how other cultures deal with it. All of these are to try to increase our fact base so that we sort of understand how things work. But throughout, what I want you to do is I want you to question the normative judgments, okay? For our class, the most important ones are going to be good and bad, right? Is it a good or a bad thing, what they're talking about? Is the action right or wrong? That's another thing. And is it just or unjust, fair or unfair? Those are going to be the most relevant. Beauty comes in certain things, right? But we're not going to focus too much on that. All right. So whenever you're trying to deal with philosophical arguments, the point is define the terms. Really pay attention to what words seem to be carrying a lot of weight. Health. Health is going to be the target one, right? Health. That's going to be one of the big ones. But we'll see other examples too. Okay? So we've talked about defining your terms. Then the next one is does the evidence support the conclusion? And I'll also add the third point, which is, are the statements true? Okay? So these relate to validity and soundness, right? Or strength and cogency in philosophical logic. You don't have to know all of that. You didn't have to take a logic class to take this class. But roughly, what these two things are trying to get you to do is whenever you're reading, try to pick out the thesis or the conclusion that the author is trying to go for. Okay? And then all you need to do, like you don't need to do the formal argumentation stuff, But what you should be able to do is write basically, here's the conclusion or the thesis of the article, and here are 1 to 5 statements that the author makes to try to give support to that conclusion. Because in philosophy and in medical ethics, we're trying to give arguments, right? We're trying to say why it's the case that we're concluding what we're concluding, right? And so if there's not a good connection between the conclusion and the evidence, the argument isn't a very good one, okay? It's not a very good one. So if it fails to define terms, and then if it fails to connect its conclusion to all of the evidence, it's also not a good argument. But let's say the terms are clearly defined, there's a really tight connection between the conclusion and the evidence. Now we can start to go into the nitty-gritty and we can start to sort of fact check. What about are the important statements, the important pieces of evidence, are those actually true? And if they aren't true, then again, it takes away some of the strength, okay? And so those are the 3 things that I want you to keep in mind whenever we're trying to evaluate arguments. Define the terms, try to find the conclusion or the thesis and see if the evidence connects strongly to it, and then try to assess whether the pieces of evidence are actually true, right? Because you're saying that the conclusion follows from the evidence. And if the evidence actually ends up being it might connect, but if it's all fabricated, then you know that the argument is fairly weak. Now, I will caution you of one fallacy that can be kind of frustrating in medical ethics, and this is what sometimes gets called the fallacy of the perfect solution. Okay, and it's exactly what it sounds like. So fallacy is just a mistake in reasoning. Okay, and just as much as it's a problem for us to suffer from confirmation bias, we only look for information that proves ourselves right. It can also be a fallacy to be too critical in the sense that you have to realize, especially in medical ethics, that there's no perfect solutions. Okay, what makes medical ethics to me such an amazing field, and this is why I love teaching this class and why I study a little bit of it on my free time. I've written in bioethics and that kind of stuff. But what makes this interesting is that we can't help but act with relation to a lot of these problems. Okay, people in clinics have to make decisions. Politicians have to write policies. The stuff that we talk about has to have something out there. It has to have something out there. Okay? And we can't just, retreat behind theory. There has to be some sort of agreement. Okay? And the fallacy of the perfect solution basically will say that this particular argument doesn't hold up because it doesn't address all of the problems. It's like, okay. Now, typically, that's not really all that useful to say. That's not all that useful to say. What we need to do is we need to try and put all of our options on the table, right? So if we have 4 proposals for any given solution to a problem in public policy. So take something like dying of whiteness. If our problem is poor healthcare outcomes for the rural poor in states like Kansas or Tennessee or Kentucky, right? That's the problem. How do we solve that with public policy, right? If we say of solution 1 that it's not perfect, that's not really all that strong of an argument, right? What matters is kind of we can always, if there are multiple proposals on the board, we can always make these comparative judgments. How does one compare against 2, 3, and 4, and so on, right? So we don't necessarily need a perfect solution. It's good enough to have a solution that we can act on and that can guide us better than what we've been using in the past. Okay? And so on the one hand, I want you to be super, super critical of yourself and to try and shake your own arguments apart, right? Try to listen to your opponent and see what they're saying and knock down their reasons, okay? try to list your reasons and try to knock down your reasons, right? But on the other hand, dial it back in the sense that there's basically going to be no perfect ideas out there, and they're all going to have benefits and drawbacks, right? They're going to have trade-offs, and we're going to have to decide what to do. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to believe in this particular class. I don't really care which way you fall on certain issues. But what I will criticize you for is whether you've done a good job of really trying to scrutinize your conclusion or try to offer really good, true evidence. And whenever we're trying, if you're, asking, well, hey, Boomer, what counts as good evidence? Then in academia, we especially want peer-reviewed evidence, okay? Peer-reviewed evidence from journals or from really reputable journalistic places. One of my favorite magazines and one that publishes a lot of really interesting medical ethics related pieces is The Atlantic, okay? What makes those magazines good? Well, they have fact checkers. So they try to make sure that the things that the authors write in feature articles are actually true. The authors who do the good journalism, they go out and they interview experts, people who have degrees and experience in the fields, right? And peer-reviewed evidence, so this is like the stuff that I have to use in my research. What makes that so good is that whenever I submit a journal article, they send it to at least 2 reviewers who try to tear my argument apart. And if it gets published, then what that means is at least 2, but sometimes, 3 or more people have seen it and they've said, okay, this holds up, right? This holds up. That's what matters. That's what matters. Because today, right? Today, it's really easy. It's really easy to fall for seductive and lazy thinking, all right? And all sides kind of have their own versions of it. Whether it's a guy with Oakley sports shades and a baseball cap ranting about whatever in his truck, whether it's, Gwyneth Paltrow talking about whatever else in her, her new health products or whatever. There's a way in which that's easy to understand, right? It's easy to digest. They seem very confident. They speak clearly, but it may or may not hold up because the quality of their sources aren't all that great, right? So that's what I want you to do. So all of that is just preamble. All of that is just preamble to kind of talk about what we're doing in medical ethics, all right? What we're doing in medical ethics. Now, how do we start to decide what to do in certain kinds of cases? I think that there's 3 particular theories that are going to be most operative whenever we're dealing with things, all right? And they all kind of fall into place, like not super well, but kind of neatly with the 4 principles. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about the 3 theories, and then I'll relate them to the 4 principles after I talk about them as well, okay? So what's the first theory that we're going to talk about? Well, the first theory that we're going to talk about is that of Immanuel Kant. Okay? Now, Immanuel Kant is a moral philosopher, and he's going to try to find absolute and universal moral commands. Okay? What I mean by this, absolute meaning there's no exception, and universal meaning it applies to everyone. There are just going to be things that are intrinsically right and wrong. How do you know? Well, you assess the person's reasons for acting. And I'm going to abbreviate reasons as R's, okay? Whenever you're trying to evaluate whether someone is doing the right or the wrong thing, what you do is you ask them why they're doing it, right? Why are they doing it? Because for Kant, the big thing is that we're going to try to use at least 2 different ways. There's multiple others that we could potentially talk about, but 2 different ways of trying to assess whether what we're doing is right or wrong, okay? But the first piece is to try to find the maxim of our actions. Now, this is a fancy word, and it's somewhat controversial as to what Kant meant whenever he talked about this, but you can just think about this as basically a person acts because reason, right? So we have a person, they do some sort of action, and they do that action because they have some sort of reason. Okay? Now, one of the things that he talks about is the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative, okay? And what the categorical imperative is, and I know that this is a lot of jargon, but stick with me. I'm going to explain this, okay? Categorical imperative. Categorical is an idea the categorical imperative is the idea that you have to do something or you have to avoid doing something. And what categorical is doing there is it's saying it doesn't matter whether you want to do that or what your goals are. All right. I don't know if you can tell. I've got a 5 head, right? Your boy's losing his hair. Maybe someone tries to tell me you should take Rogaine. That's an imperative of sorts. They're trying to tell me to do something, right? That, though, depends on whether I want to fill in my hair, right? Maybe I like the aerodynamics of losing my hair. Maybe I want to look like Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z or something like that. I don't know, right? I don't know. But it depends on my desires and my goals. Or I have friends who are bodybuilders or strongman athletes, right? They have to eat 6,000 to 10,000 calories per day, right? So if they say you should eat 6,000 to 10,000 calories per day, that's dependent on how much you're working out and what you want to do. That's way too much food for me, right? Those are hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives. Because hypothetically, they depend on whether you want to do something else. Categorical imperatives, by contrast, hold no matter what. Don't kill innocent people. I don't care whether you want to kill innocent people. I don't care what your goals are. That just seems to hold categorically, right? It's apart from your preferences. It's apart from your life goals. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the absolute, universal sort of moral laws, the categorical imperatives, the things that we all have to do. How do we decide that? Well, Kant kind of gives us a little bit of a procedure, okay? And this is, something that philosopher Honora O'Neill, she talked about this in some of her works. Other philosophers have taken this up as well. And here's a little 4-step procedure that we can try to think about, all right? Number 1, find the maxim, right? So maybe an example that Kant talks about is, I will lie to my friend to get a loan. So basically, I need some money. And I know that my friend, although, she doesn't have a lot of money, she has an okay amount of money, and she will loan it to me, not, she won't just give me the money. She's not that rich, but she'll loan it to me if I tell her that I'll be able to pay it back, right? And so I know that if I lie to her, she'll give that money to me, okay? That's what I'm considering doing. I want to lie to my friend in order to get a small loan, right? So in step number 1, I've found the maxim, right? The sentence that says the person, what they're doing, and the main reason, right? I've set that out, okay? Then what I want to do is I want to universalize it. And what I mean by that is now we can say everyone. Everyone lies to their friends to get a loan, right? Everyone lies to their friends to get a loan, okay? So now we've gone from just the individual perspective, what I'm thinking of doing or what someone else is thinking of doing, going from one person to what would it be like if everyone did that? If everyone did that, we've universalized it. We've universalized it. Okay? Then there's two other steps. The first one is this conceivable? Meaning, can you even think about this? And is it willable? Meaning, would you want to live in a world where that sort of thing has happened? Okay, so I'm just going to explain this example very, very quickly. So Kant and Kantians are going to think that this fails at number 3. And if it fails either 3 or 4, you cannot do that thing. You cannot do that thing. So here's what Kantians are going to say about lying. You can't ever lie, okay? Why can't you lie? Well, here's the deal. Whenever I think about lying, right, I have to universalize it. And the rules that I should be acting by are rules that every rational being should be able to act by. And if I lie, and I think about a world where everyone lies, that's going to do a lot of really funny things. Because what happens in a world where all of us lie? We all realize that we're not telling the truth. And guess what? No lie works. No lie works in a world like that. Because lies depend on our ability to get our audience to think that we're telling the truth, right? In order for me to lie to someone successfully, they have to think that I'm telling the truth. But in a world where we know everyone lies, right? No lies work out. Like it's a contradiction to try to think about lying in a world where everyone lies, right? So Kant and Kantians, so the people who enjoy his philosophy, they're going to say this isn't even conceivable, so we shouldn't lie. Okay? We shouldn't lie. There's lots of qualifications that we can make here, but that's where we're going to go here. All right? But even if it hadn't failed number 3, right? And we could think about a world where everyone was lying, although Kant's going to say that doesn't make sense, because if everyone is lying, no one is lying, right? Because everyone knows that no one is telling the truth. We could think, would you want to live in a world where everyone is lying in order to get loans for their friends, right? And the answer is probably no, right? No. So this first procedure is what he calls the formula of the universal law of nature. So I'll just, write that out here. The universal law of nature. And the idea here is that you should only act on the maxim or on the principle that basically says that everyone could do that. Okay, there's technical ways. I'm trying to avoid the technical ways. But basically, you should only act on the principles such that they could be a universal law of nature, meaning everyone follows those rules. Okay? And if everyone can't follow those rules, you shouldn't do it. Because we're looking for the exceptionless things, and we're looking for the things that apply to everyone, and we're looking for the things that you have to do even if you don't want to do them. That's what morality is all about, okay? So Kant, he's trying to help us to find the duties to act, right? We have a duty to do certain things. We should do it, we shouldn't do it. What's the first way that we can think about that? Well, we can subject what we're about to do to this universalization test. Okay, some people like that. If you're into procedural thinking, you'll probably really like that method. If you'd like extra reading on this, let me know, and I'll give you some more reading. Okay. But the second way, and this is what a lot of people like, so I will just start out calling it this: the formula of humanity. Okay, so the formula of humanity is really, really important. And it hinges on a couple of things, okay? So one of the things is that, look, if you have the ability to reason, right, you can think through things, you can assign to yourself the principles that you live by, what that does is that affords you dignity. What separates you from an object, right? The object doesn't have reason. And we can use this iPad, which I have in front of me. I can use this iPad as a tool, right? Because it doesn't, it has a price, right? It's just an object. I don't have to ask it its preferences. It's not assigning itself its things. But as soon as people have the ability to reason, that gives you a worth that's beyond all price, namely dignity. So any being that has reason, he says even aliens, right? Any being that has reason has dignity. And what dignity means is you can't just use that person as a mere means to your end. Okay? You can't use them to do what you want to do. You can't manipulate them, right? So the formula of humanity says basically, if you have dignity, you have to respect it. So respect dignity. The way that this gets said, a little more technically, is that you cannot use people as means merely, as just a path to doing what you want to do. And this is why consent is so crucial. So for medical ethics, one of the standards is freely given and informed consent. Especially in medical procedures and things like medical research. Why do we think that this is really important? Well, look, if a doctor is about to do a procedure for you, we think that, first of all, you can't be forced into doing this, right? Whether it's, someone is pressuring you to do it, even though you really don't want to do it, we don't think that's okay. That's not you agreeing to do something because you want to do it. You're being forced into it. So we don't like that. But at the very least, we also want you to be informed, to know what's going to go on in the treatment or the procedure, to know the risks, to know the benefits. And then once you know all of that, once you have all of the relevant information, and so physicians sometimes will assess capacity of patients and make sure that they understand what's going on, that they appreciate the risks and the benefits of doing the procedure, that they've chosen something and they can kind of, converse about this, that basically is them saying that they're able to make these decisions, and then they consent into those particular decisions. Okay? Consent is really, really important. It's important in a lot of areas of life, right? Side note, y'all are college students, right? If you're dating a person and things get intimate, consent should be something that's continually given, and it should be enthusiastic, right? So that's just a side note, but this is a really, really important thing. And I think that it's something, luckily, that's becoming a little more mainstream, right? But the reason is people have dignity and you can't just treat them like objects, right? Okay, so how does this work in the real world? How does this work in the real world? Well, I would basically say that there's something like a rational endorsement of you being willing to be treated the way that you're treating other people. Okay? So for example, whenever I'm in Bingham Humanities and I decide to go to the Einstein Brothers Bagel and pick up a coffee or whatever else it is, I am using the cashier as a mere means to my end of getting coffee, right? They're helping me out with that. That's okay though. That's okay though if they took that job, without being forced into it, right? And if I'm treating them with respect while I'm doing that sort of thing. One way of thinking of this is, could I consent into being the cashier of a transaction where I'm, buying the same sort of thing? So could I take the perspective of the other person and be okay with it, right? Be okay with it. And this is why, my students here, that y'all don't usually have a problem with this, right? But this is why, it's really great to treat service workers with respect, whatever they're doing. And look, they can help you. They can serve you as a service worker, but that is not an excuse to disrespect them or to disrespect their dignity or to not treat them like human beings. And this is what Kant is basically trying to say, right? The formula of humanity here is really, really important because humans have reason, which means that they have dignity, and that means that you must respect them. Okay. Let's return to the example of lying to my friend to get a loan. Kant says that these different formulations of the categorical imperative, all of that is jargon, they basically are going to say the same thing. So the formula of humanity would say the reason why it's wrong for you to lie to your friend to get a loan is that you're using your friend as a mere means to your end of getting money. It's not okay to do that. She has reason. She's afforded dignity. You have to respect her, and you're disrespecting her by lying to her just to get that small loan, right? That's not okay. That's not okay, all right? So this is Kant, okay? Immanuel Kant. And just to reiterate, certain things seem as though they intrinsically, in and of themselves, are right and wrong. And it's not that they're just right and wrong for you or right and wrong for someone else. Kant doesn't like that. He thinks that we very often try to make exceptions for ourselves or for our loved ones. He thinks that the job of morality, however, is to try to find things that hold for everyone, whether or not they want that to be the case. You have to respect people's dignity. According to the formula of humanity, or according to the formula of the universal law of nature, you have to act by principles that could be acted on by pretty much everyone else. This is, again, to avoid the exceptionalism, to get to that impartial morality. Okay, impartial morality. All right, that's system number one. Okay. System number two, and this is going to be a little bit, I guess, a little bit easier, is what is broadly called utilitarianism or consequentialism. Oops. Okay. So what this is this is a very different theory. So now, rather than looking at actions, right and wrong in and of themselves, actions are only right and wrong insofar as they produce good or bad consequences. So that's why it's called consequentialism. What makes something right or wrong is what follows from the action. For Kant, it's never acceptable to lie to someone. Why? It disrespects their humanity. Okay? For the utilitarian, no action is off the table. Everything is up for grabs, depending on what the consequences are. Okay? So the whole point of this is you want to do the action that basically promote the most good for the most people involved, right? Do the actions that promote the good for the most involved or avoid the most harm for the most people involved. The only thing that matters here is that an action, right, it leads to certain consequences, and all of those consequences need to be assessed for basically who they're good for and who they're bad for, how intense they are, how long the effects last into the future. And whenever you're assessing actions, because again, it's typical that you're going to have, maybe you're going to have actions 1, 2, and 3, right? And you find out that action 1, so this is mathy and this is abstract. This isn't actually how it would work out. But let's say that it benefits 5 people, right? And this one benefits 3 people, and this one benefits 2 people, right? But this action also harms like 15 people. This action harms 1 person, and this action harms 0 people. Okay? So what a consequentialist is going to say is what you need to do is not so much judge the actions themselves, but judge the consequences of what's going on there. And what you want to do is to do the most good for everyone that you can, or avoid as much harm as possible, right? Avoid as much harm as possible. So something that initially might look good, like action one, where, action one is benefiting way more people than the other ones, but it also leads to harm for lots of other people. And assuming that these benefits and harms are roughly, comparable, they're roughly about the same, that basically takes action one off the table, even though if you only look at the upside, it looks good, right? But you have to consider the downsides as well. Actions 2 and 3, they end up having roughly the same net benefit, right? And so maybe they're roughly about the same, but action 2 actually harms one person, whereas action 2 doesn't harm anyone involved, okay? And so what you have to do as a consequentialist is you have to look at what the consequences of the actions are, and you have to try to figure out what the good is of everyone involved, okay? So let's go back to our lying example. If what I'm lying to my friend for is to get some V-Bucks for Fortnite so that I can get some cool emotes, right? Or something like that, video game stuff. That's not a good reason to harm my friendship with my friend and harm her financial status potentially, right? She's taking harms just so that I can get a really stupid good. The consequential is going to say, yeah, that's not okay. Let's change the example, okay? What happens if what I'm, lying to my friend for is to basically get insulin for one of my parents who has diabetes, right? Because they can't afford it. And this is literally going to save my parents' life. First of all, I mean, this is like a bad thing about this hypothetical. My friends are typically going to loan the money if they knew that this was the main reason. But let's just say that, for whatever reason they can't know. Maybe my parent is self-conscious or something like that. On the whole, that seems like a pretty good thing to do. Saving one life at the expense of a small lie to a friend, right? So the lie itself doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's disrespecting the friend, because on the whole, it's literally saving a life, okay? So the utilitarian or the consequentialist perspective to morality is to try to appeal to the consequences of the action. That's what matters most. So both the Kantian ethicist and the utilitarian are what are called act-based moral theorists, because they're looking at specific actions. But Kantians and utilitarians traditionally are interpreted as opposites, because Kant doesn't care about the consequences. He doesn't care about your desires or anything like that. He wants to know what you absolutely should avoid doing or should do. Whereas the utilitarian, everything hinges on the consequences. Everything hinges on the consequences, okay? Everything depends on what follows from the particular action, all right? Now, this is going to be in contrast to a third theory, and this is called virtue ethics. And there are lots of different varieties of virtue ethics. But I'm going to give you the one of the Aristotelian variety. Okay? And I'm also going to give you a very traditional or orthodox interpretation of Aristotle, even though there are other interpretations possible. So for virtue ethics, it's not an act-based moral theory, right? Like Kantian ethics or consequentialism or utilitarianism, right? Those are looking at specific actions. Rather, what we're doing here is we're assessing character. Because there are two questions here that are really important for the Aristotelian virtue ethicist. And one is, what is a good or a meaningful, or what sometimes gets called a happy life? So Aristotle's going to use happiness, but I use good and meaningful because that makes a little more sense to us. What is a good, meaningful, happy life? Okay? So automatically, we're zooming out. We're being more holistic. We're not just looking at individual actions or the reasons for the actions or the consequences of the actions. Now we're looking at life as a whole. Life as a whole, the entire narrative. And a specific person, it matters what culture we're in. It matters how we're embodied. It matters that I have pale skin, right? It matters that I'm a gruff-looking dude, right? Those things matter, okay? And it matters kind of what we're working with to figure out what we can accomplish. What are my goals in life? What am I trying to do? What do I want to do? And what do we think all people should do? Right? There's stuff like we think people should develop their capacities as well as they can, right? Develop your talents. We think people should have really significant engagement with their communities. We think people should probably have some good friendships, right? We think that people should have opportunities for education and recreation. There's a whole gamut of lots of really big human experiences that if you didn't have, we would say that your life is worse off for that. And so where virtue ethics start is trying to say, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a good life? And then the second question is, what kinds of character do we need to develop in order to achieve that? So what character should we develop? And I'm going to abbreviate develop to achieve one. Right? Because now the question is, given that we're all interested in leading a happy life, a meaningful life, a life that we consider good, what Aristotle calls a complete life that's missing nothing. Given that that's all of our goals, we all want to do that. Even if we disagree on what that is, we agree that we're all trying to strive to live a good life. Now the question is, what kind of person do I need to shape myself into in order to achieve that good life, right? What kind of person do I need to make myself to give myself the best chance? Okay? Now, what typically happens with this is that we get something like virtues, which are the good character traits, and these are in between what are called vices. Let me do a different color with that, actually. We'll go with vices. And vices are the bad character traits. These are the things that we want to avoid. And so, what is a virtue? Well, a virtue is typically, it's a disposition in ourselves. So it's something like a habit, okay? It's hard to change once we've fully developed it. But it's something like a habit that helps us to face some universal situation that we all face in life, okay? So I'm going to put a different color to show that there are indeed situations or emotions or things that all of us face that we need to figure out how to deal with. One of the classic examples is fear. Okay? So we have fear. All right. Why is this a universal situation? Well, it's hard to think of any living being that doesn't have to deal with fear. Why is this something that we have to be careful about? Well, look, whether you like it or not, you're going to develop some sort of disposition or a habit with respect to fear. Okay? You face fear a lot. And through repeated interactions with fear, that's either going to cultivate a good character trait or a bad character trait. The good character trait, the virtue, is what we call courage. Okay? And the courageous person feels fear, but they don't let it overwhelm them. Okay? It's perfectly normal to feel this emotion and to face situations where we're scared, but it's not a good thing to always be scared. So that's too much fear. That's a coward. Right? Or cowardice as the vice. Or to be rash or rashness. That's someone who's never afraid. So the idea isn't that we have to be perfect or even like super extreme. What often this gets explained as is the mean between the extremes, the mean between the extremes, okay? This doesn't always hold, but Aristotle says, look, ethics is sometimes kind of fuzzy, right? And as a general rule that holds a lot of the time, what you want to do is you want to consider, what are the bad ways of acting? What are the bad ways of acting? So if we don't know what courage looks like in a situation, we can certainly think, what would a coward do? And what would someone who is very rash would do, right? What's someone who's scared and they would let that determine how they live versus someone say, hey bro, hold my beer, and then go do something really stupid, right? So we know the extremes that we're trying to avoid. Courage is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? Somewhere in the middle. It's the mean between the extremes. It's between excess and deficiency, right? That's what we're trying to get at with fear. So courage is a virtue because it helps us to face fear, which is a universal thing that we all face, all right? And it's perfectly okay to be scared, but we don't let that stop us. And just think about all of the things that fear is involved in, right? Fear is involved in failure. You would never try new things or maybe go to college. You would never try to go hang out with new friends or ask someone out or go up for the promotion or any number of things. All of these things inspire fear in us, and that's okay. It's okay. It's a human aspect, right? But it's not okay, and it's going to affect our lives badly if we don't learn how to manage it, okay? If we're always afraid, then we don't go for the promotion. We don't go to college. We don't try the new hobby. We don't ask the person out. All of that bad stuff means that we're not going to be able to live that good life that we were talking about, right? But on the other hand, if we're never afraid, we're going to end up doing really stupid things that, again, is going to impact our abilities to live well. So other character traits are things like moderation. Okay, and this is a really, really important one as well, because this is in relation to pleasure and pain. All right, so the idea is, in order to be moderate, the idea isn't that you should shun all pleasure, because you're a human. You have a capacity to enjoy life. You should enjoy life, right? But the point is that you shouldn't overindulge and let pleasure run your life. The classic example here is something like an addict, right? And you can be addicted to any number of things. Maybe we talk about video games, right? Because that starts to affect your life. So what the virtue ethicist tries to do is they try less to focus on actions, and more to focus on the overall context of an action in the kind of person who does that action. What would a good person do in this situation? And what is the effect on your life, right? What happens if you do this? Does it affect your ability to achieve that good, meaningful, complete life that we're all sort of striving for? All right. The last thing that I'll say with respect to virtue ethics, and this is really important, is look, a lot of these theories are reason heavy. Okay? They're very reason heavy. Kant explicitly says that emotions don't matter for morality. They're just basically irrelevant. The consequentialists, that calculus where you're trying to look at the consequences, the emotions don't really play here. For the virtue ethicist, reason is still important. That's what's allowing you to figure out what a good life is and how you can make plans to achieve it, or it's what allows you to reflect and train yourself to become a good person. But reason is only one psychological capacity among many, because emotion also matters here. Motivation also matters here. And tact also matters here. Okay? So in some ways, virtue ethics ups the bar. It's not good enough to just do good things. Now, you should do good things, and it's a good thing if you do good things. But you also have to feel good about doing good things and feel bad about doing bad things. So if you lie to your friend unintentionally, let's say, you should feel the need to correct that, right? If you do a good thing, you should feel good about that. You should be motivated to do it, not just sometimes, but all the time. And you're constantly trying to get better such that the actions become second nature, all right? So I'm going to give you an example. And this is a social virtue, generosity. At some point in most of our lives, we're going to have more than we actually need. Okay? We're going to have more than we actually need. And what is important here is that with generosity, what you're trying to do is trying to make sure that even though you have more than you actually need, right, you could help people out with those resources. You could help people out with those resources. So let's say that you're walking down Bardstown Road or whatever, right, hanging out with your friends, and you happen to have a little bit of extra pocket change, and a homeless person asks you for some money so that they can go get some Wendy's or whatever else, right? Because there's a Wendy's on Bardstown. If you have the money, you probably should give them a little bit of money, right? Or offer to go buy them some food and bring it out to them, something like that, right? You have more than you need. It's not going to affect you, and it can help this person out, right? But here's the important thing. Here's the important thing. If you're doing the generous thing, but you feel uneasy about doing that, you're not fully virtuous. Okay? It's a good thing that you're doing, but you need to keep training yourself such that you feel good about doing the good thing. Right? Tact also matters. If you basically don't look this person in the eye and like treat them as subhuman or throw money at them, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. You have to be careful about what you're doing. So this is a problem with some philosophers and maybe even academics, aka neckbeards, even though I have a bit of a neckbeard myself, is that there's no, easy way to say it, but certain people can just be assholes because they're so self-certain and they think that, they're right. And maybe they are right, but that doesn't keep you from being a jerk, right? Tact matters. How you do things matters. How you feel while you're doing it matters. And this is what the virtue ethicist is going to say. Reason is running the game. It's helping you to figure out what a good life is and what kind of character traits you should develop in yourself. But your emotions also matter, right? You need to be careful about that. Your motivations matter. Good people aren't fully virtuous until they're just doing the right thing just naturally, right? Now, it doesn't just happen naturally. It happens over the course of a lifetime and us being self-conscious and aware and training ourselves. But it should feel natural. It should flow naturally from ourselves. And we have to be tactful, right? And that's the sort of bar that's being raised, okay? So before I move on to the 4 principles, let's just do a really, really quick summary. Really quick summary, okay? So we have the Kantians, right? And they're looking for the intrinsic rights and wrongs. All right? The most important thing here is that you're trying to figure out what's universally right. So different use of are there being right, or you're trying to respect dignity, but you're looking at the actions themselves and you're trying to decide what would it be like if everyone did it, or is what I'm doing going to respect the dignity of all people involved, even myself? Like I can't get rid of my own dignity, right? That's in contrast to the utilitarians. Okay? And what they're going to do is they're going to look at instrumental rights. Whoops. Because it's instrumental in the sense that you're trying to promote the good or avoid bad for the most involved. Okay? So they're kind of opposites. Kantians looking at the action, doesn't matter what the consequences are, doesn't matter whether or not you want to do it. You have to do it because you have to act based on principles that everyone could act on, or you have to you have to respect everyone's dignity, right? The utilitarians, all actions are sort of on the table, and what matters most is that you're doing the greatest good for the greatest number involved. greatest good for the greatest number involved, or you're avoiding the most harm for the most people involved. Okay? And that's in contrast to the virtue ethicist, where they're looking at a good life and they're looking at character. Okay? Rather than focusing on individual actions, you can get specific actions. Good people do lots of good things, right? But you're placing that within the context of the scope of an overall life and what kind of person that makes us. So the focus isn't on actions, the focus is on us. And the focus is on our lives, generally speaking. Okay? Those are the three big normative theories. And those are the different ways that typically people are going to justify things. So you're going to look at potentially these issues from three different perspectives. Okay? All right. Thanks for sticking with me so far. Let's hit the 4 principles of biomedical ethics. So these are coming from this book right here. This is actually one edition old. I should get the new edition by Tom Beauchamp and James Childress. Okay. Basically, what happened is the 1900s saw a lot of really messed up things. And doctors have propagated some of these really messed up things. So in the book, they talk about the example of drapetomania, right? Which is the idea that they classified as a mental illness, that slaves wanting to escape their owners are mentally ill. Bonkers, right? But Samuel Cartwright said that it was a mania and used medicine to try to say that that's wrong. In the 1950s, the DSM-1, so sort of the diagnostic manual for psychotherapists, listed homosexuality as a mental illness. Okay, and there was actually a Scandinavian country that whenever governments and stuff were accepting this as public policy, they did a call-in where basically they claimed that they were taking a sick day because they were gay, and because it was an illness that was recognized by the government as an illness, the government couldn't do anything about it, right? So there were lots of protests like that, as in addition to other stuff, right, that led to the reclassification of something like being gay. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, a bunch of American professors at institutions like Harvard and Johns Hopkins were eugenicists. And they claimed that the white race was superior, or that people with intellectual disabilities were far inferior. Guess who took inspiration from that? The Nazis, right? And then they, through a bunch of scientists, the most infamous being Josef Mengele, did lots of really terrible experiments. Also in America, and this is one we'll talk about, the Tuskegee syphilis study, where a group of scientists basically tricked a bunch of black men in the South to, they told them that they were going to get medical care. They didn't really. And they just wanted to watch how syphilis wrecked their bodies. Okay? So all of this stuff is happening, and it's really terrible. There's a terrible history in medicine. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So medical ethicists were like, well, what should we do about this, right? And Tom Beauchamp and James Childress, they came up with a version of this sort of stuff. And if you want to see any in-depth defense or definition of what these principles are, this is the book to use. And we could have used this in class had I not chosen to teach it in this particular way. But these are going to look like pretty familiar. Okay, some of them are. So let's look at the 4 principles, or the 4 principles of biomedical ethics, as they are called. All right. The first one is respect for autonomy. Okay. Nomos is Latin for law, right? Or a rule. Auto, self. What autonomy is your ability to decide things for yourself and your ability to live by the principles that you give yourself. Okay? And we think that it's really important that if you're a person and you can think through things, that we respect your ability to decide for yourself. Freely informed consent. It's tied to this principle right here. It's also tied to Kant, right? We heard Kant talk about reason, and reason allows us to think through things. And the reason why we universalize things is because we're trying to find the actions that all of us could live by, the principles that we're living by to make us the best, right? So there's a little bit of overlap, right? But the respect for autonomy means that we always want to make sure to try as much as possible to make sure that patients in a clinical setting understand what they're doing and they're able to decide for themselves. Side note, this can come in degrees, okay? Children can decide what kind of food they want to eat or what they want to watch on TV, but they can't decide whether they want to undergo radiation therapy for a really complicated form of cancer, okay? Especially if they're really young children, like 6 or 7, right? So in contexts like that, the decision will usually go to the parent or to the legal guardians, right? We start to get into gray area with respect to reproductive stuff and drug use and that kind of stuff, where physicians often will ask parents maybe to step out of the room if you're dealing with like a 15 or a 16-year-old, so that you can get the patient to talk a little more openly, a little more freely, right? So teenagers are kind of a problem as far as like they give unique ethical things, but autonomy, generally speaking, you want to respect the autonomy of everyone involved. Now, also important to mention here is physicians or healthcare workers also have autonomy, okay? And it's a debate as to when the doctor wants, or let's say if the patient wants something and they seem rationally to be requesting it, but the doctor does not want to do that, does the doctor nonetheless have to do that thing, right? Because there's a conflict of autonomy here. You have the patient's autonomy, you have the physician's autonomy, right? So one example here is something like a cosmetic amputation. So let's say that someone, for whatever reason, decides that they don't want their left leg below the knee. Okay, they want that amputated, and they go to the doctor and they say, "Hey, doc, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this. I'd like to have this part of my leg amputated." Say that it's stable. They've said this multiple times to the doctor. Say that they've been psychologically assessed and they've been found to be a fairly reasonable person. They have money, they're willing to pay for everything, etc. So nothing's even coming from insurance, right? Completely optional, they want this done. But the doctor doesn't want to do it because the doctor adheres to a very strict interpretation of the medical code, do no harm, right? They don't want to harm the patient. They think that they will be harming the patient. So whose autonomy wins out in that particular instance? It's not clear, and I'm not going to give you an answer, right? But autonomy is sort of the operative principle here because the patient is specifically requesting for something to be done, and the doctor is specifically deciding that they don't want to do that, right? But autonomy is really important here. So far as we have reason, right, and we're assessed as competent, then we should be able to make decisions for ourselves. Now, some people want to say that Beauchamp and Childress, they are like autonomy focused. I don't buy that at all. They explicitly say that they aren't. I don't think that's the case. The other side note that I will add here, right, is that certain people are going to criticize this principle as overtly individualistic, meaning in America, we tend to think of autonomy as something that individuals decide for themselves. Okay, individuals decide for themselves. But in other cultures, so in our medical ethics book, they talk about a couple of African countries. In other case studies, you'll often hear about the Confucian tradition in Eastern China, right, or in China, right, where a family is doing things. Another sort of debate that can happen within these like autonomy debates is, what is the unit of autonomy? So even if you don't think that the individual is the person who decides, and maybe it's the family or maybe it's the social group, right? The tribe or whatever else. That's completely fine. I think it's still talking about autonomy. Who gets the right to make the decision? And are we making sure that we're respecting the right of people to make decisions? Okay? That's what the principle of respect for autonomy is. Okay? Let's switch colors. Also, I don't know why my camera isn't focusing. I apologize for that, but I hope it's not too big of a problem. There are a couple of principles that are going to go hand in hand, so I'm going to put them in the same color. One is beneficence, and one is non-maleficence. Okay? Beneficence, bene, actively doing good, right? Maleficence, mal, bad, meaning non-maleficence mean actively avoiding harm, okay? Actively avoiding harm. So what you want to do with beneficence, you want to make sure that you're always doing the things that benefit the most number of people, or with non-maleficence, always do the things that avoid the most harm. What does this sound like? Sounds like utilitarianism, right? These people were smart. Okay, this is intentional. These are intentional connections. So basically, what you're trying to do here is you're trying to find actions that actively promote good or actively avoid bad. All right, and that's kind of what's going on here. All right, so I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory, given that we talked about utilitarianism. All right, and then the last one, which is a big one, but it's one that's not really talked about too much, is justice. Okay, justice. So here what we're trying to do is we want to make sure that the benefits and the burdens of society are distributed fairly. Okay, benefits and the burdens are distributed fairly. Now look, this happens in a lot of ways in a hospital. Okay, where do the doctors have their offices? There are a lot of neighborhoods that don't really have that many doctors in them. Okay, where are the stores that sell the most nutritious groceries? Which people have access to health insurance? Okay, are people being believed in the same ways? So there are multiple studies that basically confirm that the pain reports of women are not taken seriously with respect to men, or the pain reports of black and brown people are not taken the same as white people, right? There are so many studies that show this time and time again. That's definitely a problem of justice. But it's not just that kind of stuff. It's like, I think that, some of y'all are going into healthcare administration, who's carrying the burdens, right? In a hospital. The administrators might be doing injustice because they don't fully staff the nurses, or they don't give enough supplies to the techs, or they put too much of the working burden on residents who aren't getting paid all that much money, right? There are so many things where the burdens are being passed on inequitably to other people, and the benefits are going to a very small select population. These are concerns of justice. And I can give you very quickly a few different theories that might be relevant here, okay? That might be relevant here. One is what we can call Rawlsian, maybe Rawlsian liberalism, but this is from philosopher John Rawls, okay? And his idea is basically justice as fairness. Justice as fairness. We want to make sure that people, on the whole, are being treated fairly. And on the whole, we want to tend toward egalitarian measures. We want to be more equal with one another, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be inequalities, okay? But what John Rawls is going to say is that it is just, or the only inequalities that are just, the only inequalities that are just are the ones that, on the whole, benefit everyone or bring the least well off as close to the good as possible, right? So here's an example. Maybe we want to, all things considered, keep paying neurosurgeons a fair amount of money, right? Why might that be okay? Maybe not the amount of money that they make in America, maybe the amount of money that they make in other countries, because America pays its doctors very, very well. Why might it be justifiable to pay neuroscientists more than, say, nurses? Well, everyone has access to potentially becoming a neurosurgeon. It's really competitive, but no one is closed off in principle from becoming a neurosurgeon, right? And if society has neurosurgeons, we're better off for that, right? There's like, it's better if we have more healthcare professionals with really great training, right? So if there is inequality, that inequality has to be such that everyone could access it and everyone is better off for that inequality existing. Now, what's happening on the other side? Now, if you take something like the Americans with Disabilities Act that says that federal buildings have to have certain types of wheelchair accessibility or elevators or other services that help, for example, the hearing impaired or people with visual disabilities or whatever else it is, right? That is an unequal treatment. We are using more resources to retrofit buildings or to make sure that people with disabilities can interact on roads, like on the sidewalks or whatever, or, in government buildings. How is that justifiable? Well, it's justifiable because on the whole, everyone is sort of better off because here's the thing. We all potentially could end up in that lower position. And rationally speaking, according to Rawls, we're typically going to want to agree to make sure that the least well-off among us are made as good as possible. Okay? So on the whole, we want to be equal, we want to be fair. But if there is inequality, it should be such that everyone can access it. If it's like inequality in a good direction, everyone can access it and it benefits everyone. And if it's devoting resources to a particular group, it's okay to maximize the welfare of the least well off, right? Sometimes called the maxi-min principle. Because we know that society is better off when we do that, and it could have been us, right? It could have been us. So on the whole, we want to be equal, and that's kind of how that plays out. The second thing is a kind of libertarianism. Okay, now this is going to be a more conservative type of argumentation that says that all that a government should do is basically make sure that individuals and their properties are protected, right? So I am sovereign over my body. You cannot use me. You cannot use any of my property without my permission, right? You protect that. No one should be harmed. The government should totally protect the rights to self and the rights to property. And then number two, you should make sure that there's fair, basically contracts between other people. So ensure fair trade. So if I say that I'm going to do something, I actually follow through with it. And if I don't, then there needs to be some sort of punishment or enforcement of something on me, right? But other than that, basically government stays out of it. Because the big difference between sort of the Rawlsian and the libertarian approach is that the Rawlsian is going to use the government as much as possible to try to enforce a vision of a good life in society, right? They're going to say, look, part of what it means to be American is that we think that you shouldn't go bankrupt from medical bills, right? Part of what we think it is to be American is to make sure that you have access to nutritious food. Part of what we think it is for you to be American is to make sure that if you get some sort of physical disability, you can get around in the buildings that you need to, right? They're perfectly okay with saying that, those sorts of values are things that government should enforce. The libertarians are a little more skeptical, and they're going to say, I just don't want to use the government to impart that many values. Now, it's okay if individual communities do that, right? If you are part of, say, an Amish community and you decide a set of values, that's fine, right? But a government shouldn't be involved in that. And that's sort of the difference between those two camps. And then the last one is what I'm going to call the capabilities approach. And this is the way virtue ethicists deal with theories of justice. And this is the idea with, remember when I was talking about what is a good life? What are the things that we think a good life involves? Well, it typically involves health, right? Typically involves social integration. It typically involves access to education. So you start to look at the capabilities or the capacities that all humans have, and the things that we think make up a good life, and we want to figure out if a government can be used to help those things along. So what the capabilities approach is doing is trying instead to, not just looking at quantitative measures, although quantitative measures are important, and not just looking at abstract policies, but what are the lives of the people like that live in a particular society? And what you want to do with a government is you want to try to make sure that people are able to live the best lives possible. Again, this is a way of imparting values through government and making sure that people's capacities are respected. People's capacities are respected, right? So that's, all of that is to deal with justice. Any one of those theories you could subscribe to. I don't expect you to know all of these nuances, but with justice, know the benefits and the burdens. So those are the 4 principles, right? And those are super, super influential, okay? Respect for autonomy, meaning people should be able to make decisions for themselves. Beneficence, meaning actively doing good. Non-maleficence, meaning avoiding doing bad. And justice, meaning making sure that the distribution of benefits and burdens in society is fair, right? That it's equitable. All right. And those are the 4 principles. Autonomy sounds like Kant. Beneficence and non-maleficence sounds like utilitarianism. And virtue ethics can be sprinkled in all of these basically as well. All right. So it's a lot of information. And all of this was kind of in the background of what's going on. And I wouldn't recommend that you do this, but if you were to go back and reread this, I think you would see that these principles are operative in a lot of the examples that are sort of going on. So as we're moving forward in medical ethics, I want you to think about these values explicitly. Whenever you are justifying what you would do in a particular case or scenario, try to give reasons based on one of the principles, or try to give reasons based on Kantianism or utilitarianism or virtue ethics. And if you need more help, let me know. But let me close with an example. So this is why I had y'all read the piece by Sherry Fink about Memorial Hospital during Hurricane Katrina, right? And ultimately, Dr. Anna Poe was put on trial for murdering patients because she pushed basically a cocktail of medicines that sedated the patients and ultimately killed them, right? So people were very concerned for what happened there. What are the concerns that we could talk about? Autonomy. She basically didn't ask a lot of the patients whether they wanted this to have them happen. Beneficence. Was she actively doing good by pushing this medication rather than not? Non-maleficence. Was she avoiding harm? Was there something merciful in the way that she was doing this, as opposed to, for example, leaving them in a hospital that seemed as though it was going to be deserted? Because this happened on day 5 when it wasn't clear that they were going to be evacuated, right? And justice. Is it bad, or what does this indicate, that the people who were euthanized were, elderly, or they were people of different races or socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So what these values allow us to do is to begin to assess really difficult situations. So I think I'm going to stop there. I've been talking at you for like an hour and a half, and we can get into the specific cases as we move on. Feel free to email me to ask for more details. But I want you, if you can, learn these theories. Learn utilitarianism, learn Kantianism, learn virtue ethics, and learn the 4 principles, especially the 4 principles, because this is going to be how we're going to talk about cases and how we're going to evaluate things. Thank you. I'll see you next time.